In this video, we're going to look at 4 in our question design process, which is the wording of the questions themselves. So let's start here by making sure that our wording is clear. Using simple words, we want to make sure that we are asking our questions at the level of education of our respondents. So typically that would be about the 10th grade level if you are asking questions to the general population. If your survey is going to doctors or engineers, then you could use more technical jargon or a higher level. But in general, we typically go about the high school level, about grade 10. We also want to avoid ambiguous words that are not clear. So when we are creating, for example, our itemized rating scales, so here's a question about Blockbuster. I don't know how people are actually renting movies from Blockbuster anymore because I think there's like, one left. So in this particular question here, we have a scale, right, from never to always. And notice there's some challenge here because on the scale in between never and always is occasionally, sometimes, often, regularly. There needs to be knowledge. You need to have a clear separation and common understanding of the difference. Because the problem is often and regularly, they're kind of the same, right? Occasionally and sometimes are kind of the same. So that's why, as we talked about in one of our previous videos, using some standardized scales, and I'll just put up one more time some of those standardized scales, that is helpful. Where is this thing coming from? That in terms of making sure that it is language that is not ambiguous, that it is clear what we mean and what the difference is in the scale. So let's just pull that up. So we looked at this before. This is from Clemson University and has really good in terms of itemized rating scales to make sure that that language that you're using is clear. So you can see here, like level of acceptability, we have total, unacceptable, slight, and then we go the same in the other direction. Or if we're looking at level of importance, not at all, low, slightly, neutral, moderately, very, extremely. The challenge, of course, when you have your 7-point scales, you're getting quite a number of points. There's a higher risk that it's not as clear. So one of the benefits of the 5-point scale, if we look here at never, rarely, sometimes, often, always, then that is a bit more clearly understood in terms of what they are. So we want to be careful about that. The best way to protect yourself in terms of making sure that you are using wording that is clear is to use the words that others use and that many people have done in previous surveys. Things that people are used to seeing, like strongly disagree to strongly agree, with neither in the middle, and agree and disagree. So this source here, we've gone through this a bit before. These provide great ones because these are what you see in other surveys. These are more standards that people have used. And so stick with what is proven for that wording to ensure that it's clear. You can also, depending on how you structure your attitude scale, is you don't have to give names to the pieces in between. You have very negative, very positive, neutral, and you can see how there's just a number in between. That's an option as well to reduce confusion because people know that this is the feelings in between very negative and neutral, and these are the feelings between neutral and very positive. So you don't have to give them names if you think names will create confusion. All right, so we want to make sure we are clear in what we are asking so that it is interpreted the same by those who are completing the survey as it is by the people who are analyzing the survey. When we talk about making sure our wording is clear, we want to avoid the double-barreled question. We had talked about that previously. Notice in this question it asks, how satisfied were you with the price and the quality of service you received? When they answer the question, we don't know, as we're analyzing the data, whether they're responding to the price or whether we're responding to the quality. So we would want to separate them out. How satisfied were you with the price? And then you have your scale. How satisfied were you with the quality? And then you have your scale. We could then see if there's a relationship between how they feel about price and how they feel about quality. Maybe they're connected because it's about bang for your buck. But we wouldn't want to throw them into the same question because they don't know which one they're answering and we don't know which ones they answered. So it makes it hard for them to answer the question and hard for us to analyze the results. Avoid biasing the respondent. So avoid leading questions. Be careful about the way you've worded the question that makes assumptions. So here in this particular one, do you feel that limiting taxes by law is an effective way to stop the government from picking your pocket every payday? So notice that picking your pocket is very charged words. And so it has that negative connotation. So by asking it that way, by using the phrase picking your pocket, you're already kind of pushing them to respond that the government needs to stay out and stop taxing me so much, right? So you're already leading them to a response as opposed to being neutral in the question to get at how people actually feel. So do you feel that limiting taxes is a way for you to retain more of your income, right? Like you just take out the charged language. Also avoid unstated alternatives. So the challenge we have with questions is, we don't quite know what the assumptions they're making are. This one says, would you like to have a job if it were possible? Well, that's different than saying, would you like to have a job? Yes, I would like to have a job. By adding in this, if it were possible, there's this extra component here of first, do I want the job? But also the context around, well, what's happening in the market? And so there's some issues there, right? And then what if we asked it this way? Would you prefer to have a job or do you prefer to do just your housework? So what are we asking in terms of the question? First of all, what does no mean? Yes or no questions to things where would you prefer to do this or that? That doesn't make any sense, right? It needs to be, if you're asking me if I prefer this or that, if I prefer a job or staying home and doing housework, then the choices should be stay at home or housework, not yes or no. We want to be very clear in our wording and we want to make sure we're not biasing it by being very clear what we're asking for. Are we asking just whether they want a job, yes or no? Are we asking them which they like better, a job or being a stay-at-home individual in their household? What is it? The benefit of the second question of do you have a job or do you want to stay at home is that there are no unstated alternatives. We're asking, do you like option A or option B? With the first one, would you like to have a job if it were possible? There's a lot of unknowns there that would be that part about making it possible or not. So we do want to be very clear as to what the alternatives are, but we also want to be clear in the options that if you're saying, do you prefer to have a job or do you prefer to stay at home? Then the answers to the question should be job or home, not yes or no. So be careful about how you word your questions. It's always a good idea to have somebody else answer your survey as just a test to make sure that there is not some response that they would give that's not there, and to make sure that it makes sense. Avoid assumed consequences. This question here says many experts believe that placing price controls on crude oil will result in lower prices, but may also mean lower gasoline production, gasoline rationing, and longer lines at the pump. Are you in favor of placing price controls on crude oil? So again, a lot of information in this question, right? So it's making it overly complicated here. And here we're trying to say, okay, well, if there was this price cap, then yes, there'd be lower prices, but the problem would also be that there would be a lot longer lines and less that are less gas available. So are you willing to do the trade-off is kind of what it's getting at. but it is overly complicated. It's if this happens, then this happens, then that happens, and you're making a lot of assumptions. A much more streamlined question said, would you be in favor of placing price controls if it would lead to gas rationing? More clear, more concise, not as convoluted, not as many assumptions. And so we're basically saying, are we willing to do this trade-off? So notice how much more simplistic that is. If we were doing this survey, we probably also want to change the wording to not be price controls, because we're assuming that people know what that means. So we would maybe change that to be, would you be in favor of a cap on oil prices if it might lead to less gas available, right? So something quite simplistic. In this particular example here, in version A, it's a good idea to pass a law requiring motorcycle riders to wear helmets. When the wording was this way, then we found that 73% agreed. Whereas when the question was worded, there should be a law to make all motorcycle riders wear helmets, then the agreement was down to 60%. So notice that change in wording in terms of much stronger language, instead of it's a good idea, there's a there should be. So much more strong language there changes it. And this had all these extra pieces here. Pass a law to require them to wear helmets instead of that there is a law, right? So more clear, simplistic language that we see in version B is more what you want. So specific consequences as opposed to assumed consequences. Be specific, be straight to the point, not wishy-washy in the statement. And that is much clearer in terms of people knowing what they are actually answering. When we are deciding on question wording, consider your respondent's ability to answer the question. So again, we want to make sure that they are informed enough to answer the questions. Avoid generalizations and estimates. Try to be very specific in what you're asking for. As we mentioned when we talked about the constant sum scale in our previous video, don't ask your participants to do math. If you want to know how often they do something, put it as narrow as time as you can. So how many times within a week? If you ultimately care about a year, you multiply it times 52. Don't ask them to figure out how often they do it within a long period of time. It reduces the accuracy. It's much harder for them to complete the survey. Remember, they have this faulty recall. And again, if you make it complicated math, then that increases the chances of errors. I don't know why I keep getting these little thumbs up signs. I gotta figure out how to turn that off. I'm glad that my computer thinks it's great, but I don't know why it's doing that. So we'll have to figure out what's going on there. Thumbs up from my computer about the video. All right. Which really matters, right? Is that the computer, the AI overlords support what you're doing, right? All right. So we don't want them to do math. We want to make sure they're informed and are able to answer the questions, which is why we want to make sure that we have a screen we talked about before. And that screen is going to make sure that only those who have an opinion or know about a topic are the ones who can answer it. So we want to make sure the question is worded so that people aren't making a wild guess. And we want to make sure that we have a question beforehand to make sure that when we get to a question, it's only to the people who've used the product, who know about it, who have an opinion about a certain thing. We reduce that measurement error by not asking people about things they don't have an opinion about or don't have knowledge about. And then the other thing is to consider the respondent's willingness to answer the question. So you might be asking questions that are more of a sensitive nature. One way to deal with those is to use some of the techniques from a projective test, and we talked about that in previous videos, which is to ask about people they know or people in general. How do people in general feel about a topic, or how often do people in general participate in some kind of illicit behavior, rather than asking them about themselves. So that projective test and a third-party technique is one way to get people to respond when it's a question of a more sensitive nature. The other thing, as we get into the section about question order, is that questions of a more sensitive nature we put later into the survey. The idea being, once we get you comfortable and you've already committed time and you put in answers to all these other questions, what's one more question to answer? And so questions that are a bit more sensitive in nature need to be towards that back end of the survey, and we'll look at that in our next video. Other tips for wording. Let's just see if I can make this bigger. People are more likely to respond to sensitive questions if they have that assurance of anonymity. So are you guaranteeing anonymity with your survey? That is, it's not collecting any type of name or identifying information. As I said just a moment ago, we put the sensitive questions near the end of the questionnaire. We can use a counter biasing statement that indicates that the behavior or attitude is not unusual. So in this example here, it says recent studies show that 1 of every 4 households has trouble meeting its monthly financial obligations. And then you ask them a question about their finances and ability to pay bills. So you've helped reduce that kind of stigma that's attached to the ability to not pay by saying, okay, well, the study shows that it's pretty common. 25% of people can't pay their bills. So then people feel less embarrassed when they are responding to those sensitive questions. So that is a counter biasing statement that you can use to help increase the response. Phrase the question in terms of other people and how they might feel. That's that third party. Do you think most people cheat on their income tax? So again, we're not talking about you and whether you cheat on your taxes. We're talking about how other people are. We can also take questions that are of a sensitive nature and convert them into multiple choice with some brackets here. And so then if we ask you a question about, maybe you don't want to answer questions about your exact age, we've given you a range. And so that's a bit more safer to respond instead of giving the exact number. Okay. When you are designing your questions, there are words to avoid. So words like all and always and any and anybody. Okay, these words are quite limiting. You would want to avoid them. So for example, do you consider all options? Well, the problem is no one considers all options. So asking about all or always doesn't make any sense, because never is it all or always. So in other words, better wording is to ask things like, what options do you consider, or how often do you do something, not having them say, yes, I always do something. Okay, so be careful about that generalized language. That's what we're talking about here. And this one here is, what's the best feature on your new home theater system? Things like best are problematic wording. I don't know why these don't match up. What? I don't know where anybody went. Okay, but best, ever, every, most, never, worst. Again, when we have extreme language, then, never is something the absolute worst. There's always something else. And so you want to avoid some of that extreme language. These words proceed with caution, so you can include them, but be careful about them, and usually signals that we have a double-barreled question. So check and separate them into 2 questions. Be careful about words like bad. People are less willing to criticize than praise, so we want to avoid biasing language. or language that might have different interpretations. So the word dinner, for example, for some cultures that's at noon and for others that's in the evening. So we want to be more specific about what we're asking about, the evening meal or the midday meal, if you want to ask specifically about one tied to a particular type of day. Be careful about generalized language. So governments, are you referring to the city government, the federal government, the provincial government? People have different opinions about each one of those. They are less likely to like their federal government, more likely to like their local government. And so you can't just lump them all in together. Other words to proceed with caution, not. That it can be confusing when we ask questions where it's a double negative. We create confusion, so try to put things, so when you ask if someone agrees or doesn't agree with not doing something, then that's confusing. What am I actually agreeing or disagreeing with? So remove the not and then see if they agree or disagree. The double-barreled question can also appear with the word or, not just with the word and, so be careful about that. Do you prefer the liberal or conservative candidate? If you're asking questions like that, then the answer choices better be liberal or conservative, not yes or no, so that you're choosing between the two, not asking about either or. So there's some other ones here. You can have a collective meaning versus the individual. That may not be clear which one you're asking about. Where something happens, everyone has a different frame of reference. So we want to be careful in terms of our words. So these are words you want to be careful about, but you might include. Okay. These are words that you want to avoid. They tend to be very generic or very extreme. And we want to recognize that if we're asking questions of a sensitive nature, we can help increase the response of those by putting them later in the questionnaire, ensuring anonymity, using counter-biasing statements so people don't feel like they're so different from everybody else, giving people options and using projective tests. And then we can use screens to make sure that people only answer questions they are informed about. And we can make sure that the wording is clear and concise, doesn't assume consequences, doesn't have unstated alternatives, isn't a double-barreled question, uses simple words, and is framed in a way that people are more likely to understand. So if we go back to our map here, we have looked at question wording. In our next video, we're going to look at what order you put those questions in.